Okay, so we're going to take a look at the embroidered funerary mantle from the southern coast of Peru, Paracas, 1st century CE, made of primarily of wool. And you can see the human figure is very prominent on this piece. There's a prominent figure. He has very prominent eyes. He appears scores of times all over the surface of this piece. There's some flowing hair. The legs seem to be kicking, which suggests that the figure is flying or floating. They think that he's carrying batons or fans or possibly knives and hallucinogenic mushrooms. On some of the other mantles, the figures carry skulls or severed heads of enemies. And many art historians think that these flying figures that we actually will see a lot of in Andean art are Paracas religious practitioners that are either dancing or flying during a trance. They also think that these flying figures might be images of the deceased. We're not quite sure. So there's a lot of repetitions of this particular figure on this piece, but he's not the same every time he's pictured. There are variations in detail that occur. So he's not exactly the same every time you see him. The figure changes position slightly, and there are subtle color changes as well. So talking about the Inca a little bit now, when the Inca first encountered the Spanish conquistadors, they thought that it was weird that they were so fixated just on gold and silver, because the Inca valued finely woven cloth very highly, just as highly as precious metal, and textiles and clothing dominated every aspect of their culture. The leaders, stored them in great warehouses, demanded cloth as tribute, gave it as gifts, used it for negotiations, and even burned it for sacrificial offerings. Both men and women participated in cloth production, but the Inca rulers selected the best women weavers from around the empire and really sequestered them for life to produce fine cloth for the elite. So women were definitely chosen, and this was their life work for the elite, producing fine cloth. So Andean weavers manufactured their textiles by spinning yarn produced from the cotton grown on the warm coast, and then also from the fur sheared from more of the highland areas in the mountains, from llamas, alpacas, guanacos. Those are the wooled animals that they had. They didn't have sheep. And then they wove the yarn into cloth. They would also add in, gold or feathers sometimes, just to sew that on there to make them more exotic. And they used a backstrap loom. It's still used in the Andes. It basically where the weaver stretches a long warp or vertical thread up and down between two wood bars, and the top bar is tied to an upright pole of some sort. A belt or backstrap is attached to the bottom bar, and that actually encircles the waist of the weaver, who is seated and who maintains the tension of the warp threads by leaning back, and the weaver passes the weft or horizontal threads over and under the warps and pushes them tightly against each other to produce the finished cloth. The sturdy cotton often formed the warp, and the wool, which can be dyed brighter colors, served as the weft. And then they would add embroidery on top of the finished piece of cloth by sewing threads into the finished piece to kind of form contrasting designs. Particularly the Paracas culture did that. But we can see that there's a lot of baskets also containing spinning and weaving implements that have been found by excavators, and these tools are great sources of information on how textile production was done, and how closely textiles were associated with women as well, because there's many women that are buried with these baskets and the tools from weaving inside the baskets. And it's an Andean belief that textiles were necessary in the afterlife. So they do think that Andean weavers copied their designs from finished models, but the weavers were so skilled and inventive that even when they were copying something, they would add a lot of creativity to it, and there would be variations in the colors and in the forms even after it was made. And the creativity often led, Andean artists to design textiles that are highly abstract and geometric. Paracas embroideries depict humans. It's very detailed. And they sometimes reduce the figures to their essentials, but the wari compositions are a little bit different because they have a little bit more abstraction than the Paracas. So the wari really take abstraction and run with it. Lots of blocks of color that tend to overwhelm the composition with the wari embroidery. So this is Paracas here, a little bit more detail, not quite as abstract, but we will take a look at wari compositions later. We're going to move on to the Nazca next. They take their name from the Nazca River Valley, which is south of Paracas. And they're really famous for their gigantic earth drawings. You can see one here. This is the hummingbird from the Nazca Plain in Peru, 500 CE. So it's basically called a Nazca lines. There's about, 3 dozen Nazca lines that are preserved. Typically images of birds, hummingbirds, fish, plants, that kind of thing, very naturalistic. They're hundreds of feet long. There are some that are geometric in form. Spirals, straight lines, trapezoids are common. And these are immense earth drawings, like I said, called Nazca lines. They were made by removing the dark top layer of stones to expose the light clay calcite below. So they think that these are, possibly used to show water supply and irrigation lines, because they're usually situated close to water sources, and they may have marked pilgrimage routes for those who journeyed to local religious shrines on foot. So it doesn't seem to be just a meaningless maze. It seems to be kind of a map that they put in place, for helping pilgrims find water and, find different shrines throughout the territory. So that's pretty interesting. So the early centuries of the Nazca civilization basically ran concurrently with the closing centuries of the Paracas culture, and Nazca style emulated the Paracas style, but they're really renowned for their pottery because there's thousands of ceramic vessels that survive. They usually have round bottoms with doubled spouts connected by bridges, and they're very smooth, burnished surfaces. Composite mythological creatures, part human, part animal. Plants are most common. Nazca painters often depicted religious practitioners impersonating deities and sacred rituals. Many times the religious practitioners hold trophy heads and weapons. We do have some flying figures as well, and we will take a look at an example of Nazca spouted vessel with the bridge in between with flying figures. There's 2 flying figures on this piece, and it's from 200 CE, painted ceramic. So very, very abstracted. mostly focusing on the heads of the figures, whereas the bodies are very abstracted and small. And each figure wears a multicolored necklace, as you can see, a whiskered gold mouthpiece, which I'm not seeing maybe here, I guess. It looks more red to me. And then circular discs hanging from the ears here, and then a rayed royal crown on top of the head. Masks or heads with streaming hair, possibly trophy heads, flow over the impersonator's back, which kind of creates a sense of motion. So that's a really good example of Nazca pottery. Very interesting. So we're actually going to move on to the Moche now. So we'll take a look at a piece of this vessel here in a minute. So the Moche actually have the nicest ceramics. They occupied the river valleys of the northern coast of Peru at the same time that the Nazca flourished in the south. So like I said, the ceramics of the Moche rival those of the Greeks and the Maya, not only in quality, but in the amount of information that they can tell us about Moche society. Many of the pots tell us about architecture, metallurgy, weaving, the brewing of chicha, which is fermented maize beer. Also talks about human deformities, diseases, and even sexual acts. So there's a lot of information contained within Moche pottery. So this is a vessel in the shape of a portrait head from the northern coast of Peru, Moche, 5th to 6th century CE, painted clay. It's 1 foot 1 inches high, so it's quite large. Moche vessels are predominantly flat-bottomed, stirrup-sprouted jars, such as this one. So it is flat on the bottom, and then there's a stirrup-sprouted jar here. It is painted in 2 colors, or biochrome, which is basically a 2-color slip. A slip is basically a clay body watered down and painted with a paintbrush on the surface. They did not use a potter's wheel. They did use molds, so you might find several pots that are identical because they're using 2-piece molds. And the Moche potters really refined the stirrup spout, making it more of a slender, elegant tube, much narrower than Chavin examples, which are earlier. It's probably a warrior or ruler, or possibly a royal retainer that's being depicted here. It's pretty realistic rendering, quite striking. Probably has some of the individual characteristics of that person. They have found Moche pottery of different portraits of the same person that begin in childhood and go throughout different ages. Excavators have found that, which is kind of interesting. And we can move on from here. We're going to talk about Sapan, which is a burial site of elite men and sacrificial victims. It's basically a set of Moche tombs near the village of Sapan, and this is in the northwest coast of Peru. Lots of gold artifacts, thousands of ceramic vessels. This site of Sapan significantly contributed to the knowledge of the Moche culture. They even found some greatly eroded pyramids, but they found mostly lavish graves. The Lord of Saipan, or the warrior priest, is one such grave. He had a lot of really elaborate trappings that he was, buried with. This piece is an ear ornament that he was buried with, and very costly, made of gold and turquoise. And we will talk more about this in the next video. I'm actually running out of time. All right, talk to you later.